In the Middle Ages, life was built on tradition, custom, and the unspoken understanding that certain things simply were not for sale. Some resources were communal, some practices were ancient rites, and some services were exchanged through obligation rather than money. But history has a way of producing moments where one ambitious, opportunistic, or downright petty individual decides, actually, I could charge people for this. And once someone sets a precedent, no matter how ridiculous, the idea spreads like a new fad nobody asked for. Medieval society had countless examples of things that had been free for generations until one person, whether a lord, a monk, a merchant, or a king, decided to make a profit, a rule, or both. Many medieval villages relied on common land, shared fields, forests, and grazing areas essential to survival. Access to these lands was understood as a birthright. Then came the manorial lords who realized they could fence off areas or require fees for using the commons. Suddenly, families who had been grazing their animals freely for generations were told that access required payment or labor. A forest that had once been a source of firewood, berries, and game became a carefully guarded lord's preserve. The shift didn't happen overnight, but often started with a single lord testing the waters, charging a tiny fee for something minor like collecting fallen branches. Before long, that small act opened the door to a system where basic survival activities became regulated and monetized. Baking bread is another example. In many places, people traditionally bake their own bread at home using household ovens. Then a particularly entrepreneurial lord or wealthy villager might build a communal oven and require everyone to use only that oven, charging for access. The justification was often framed as safety. Communal ovens reduced fire risk, but the financial motive was obvious. A family that once baked freely now had to pay for the privilege. It sounds absurd, but it became common. Baking bread, a fundamental household task, transformed from a private right into a fee-generating monopoly. Sometimes the shift from free to charged came from religious institutions. Monasteries, originally places of charity and communal support, occasionally hired scribes or charged fees to access learning that had previously been open to all who could read and travel. Knowledge was power, and power could be monetized. A particular monk or abbot might realize that rare texts and literacy gave them advantage, and what was once freely shared wisdom became a controlled resource. This didn't happen everywhere. Many monastic communities remained generous, but it only took one influential monastery introducing charges for copying or reading texts to inspire others to follow suit. Water access was another point of friction. Rivers were free to everyone, but mills, once invented, became another tool for profit. At first, villages used hand mills without permission. Then a lord built a watermill, declared it the lay mill allowed in the region, and began charging for grinding grain. It was known as a banalete, a mandatory fee for using the lord's mill. Lords often justified this as maintaining order or ensuring fair quality, but in reality, it was a neat source of steady income. As with ovens, the monopoly took what had once been a household task and transformed it into a paid service. Roads are a familiar annoyance today, but tolls didn't always exist. Travel in the early medieval period was free unless you crossed a bridge or ferry operated by a specific family or community. Eventually, some enterprising noble decided that travelers passing through their land should pay a fee. Maybe they claimed it was for protection, maintenance, or law enforcement, but the truth was usually greed. One toll gate became two, and soon travelers found themselves paying at every border, bridge, or gatehouse. What began as the idea of one enterprising individual became a patchwork of road charges so frustrating that merchants recorded entire journals complaining about them. Markets were also originally free gatherings of people trading goods informally. But one town official or lord might declare that all trade in the region had to happen at an authorized market square, which required stall fees or taxes. The rationale was usually to maintain order and standardize measurements, but the real motive was profit and control. After one settlement implemented such a system successfully, others adopted the idea. Soon, a market rightsy became valuable privileges granted by kings in exchange for loyalty or payment. What began as a simple gathering of people freely exchanging goods turned into a regulated taxed institution. Fishing rights often fell into the same pattern. A village might freely fish a river until someone decided the fish were a resource worth owning. A noble could declare that a section of river was reserved exclusively for them and impose fines on anyone caught fishing there. It often started with a minor restriction, perhaps only on hunting certain types of fish, but soon expanded into a broader prohibition. People who had eaten from the river for generations suddenly found themselves shut out. Even celebrations weren't immune. Many festivals were community gatherings requiring no fee. But one clever organizer might see an opportunity, charging for stalls, performances, or even entry. Medieval fairs grew into massive commercial events, replacing the old free communal celebrations. The first person to commercialize a festival might have seemed reasonable at the time. They'd say the money paid for musicians, decorations, or security. But once the idea took root, events that were once open to all gradually grew controlled and costly. Guilds also played a role in turning free practices into regulated professions. A trade like weaving or brewing could be done informally in early medieval communities. Then someone formed a guild imposing standards and rules, often with fees or membership dues. The guilds were not inherently negative. They protected workers and ensured quality. But they did restrict who could participate. What had been a free or low-barrier activity became something one had to pay to enter, train in, and practice legally. The shift often started with one guild master who disliked competition and lobbied for exclusivity. In some places, even naming a child required payment. Baptisms were free for centuries, but eventually certain churches began charging for ceremonies or requiring donations that functioned as mandatory fees. It began with a single church leader insisting on compensation for their time, and the practice spread to others. Marriage ceremonies, funerals, and other rites also moved from entirely free community events to ones regulated by the church and tied firmly to fees. Medieval inns started with hospitality traditions. Many regions had customs that required households to host travelers for free. Over time, one ambitious household might transform their hospitality into a business. Once someone began charging for lodging and food, others followed. Hospitality turned into a commercial enterprise, and eventually inns, taverns, and hostels became central parts of medieval travel. The shift from hosting travelers out of obligation to offering paid lodging didn't happen everywhere at once. But again, it only took one person in one strategic location to see the opportunity. Another amusing example is the toilet problem. Most villages didn't have public latrines, and relieving yourself outdoors wasn't regulated. But in larger medieval towns, someone often saw an opportunity to profit by building public latrines and charging a small fee for their use. Once one city started doing it, others followed, and soon urban sanitation became a controlled, paid service. It's ridiculous to imagine charging people to use the bathroom when the countryside offered privacy for free, but urban density made the idea viable and profitable. Libraries once consisted mostly of monastic collections open to scholars. Eventually, some wealthy patrons created private libraries and charged research travelers for access. A single wealthy collector who wanted to limit entry began a trend of restricting knowledge behind privileges or payments. Over time, rare manuscripts became intellectual currency, accessible only to those with wealth, connections, or the willingness to pay. The biggest irony in all medieval cases of a thing's once free becoming paid is how predictable the pattern was. It almost always started with one individual who saw a resource, service, or tradition not as a communal right but as an opportunity. That person justified the change with rational arguments: safety, maintenance, justice, order, religious duty. But the underlying motive was always control, profit, or prestige. Once a precedent was set, others saw that the sky didn't fall, the community accepted the change or lacked power to resist, and the idea spread. Medieval life was full of people trying to navigate scarcity and survival, and it's unsurprising that some took advantage of opportunities. But in doing so, they fundamentally changed the rhythms of daily life. What had once been shared became privatized. What had once been a birthright became a transaction. Each time someone said, "I could charge for this," they set in motion a ripple that gradually reshaped medieval society from household tasks to public infrastructure. And so, much of the medieval world transformed bit by bit because of the moment one person, somewhere, decided that something free didn't need to stay that way.